everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we have a really interesting topic. I think everybody has been talking about ISIS, and then what's happened recently is the media attention on the refugees. Who's to blame? Who's at fault? Who thinks ISIS is a threat, and from what lens? So I have with me Professor of Middle East History at UC Irvine, Mark Levine. On Skype, Shahed Amanullah, who is the co-founder of Affinis Labs, which is an accelerator for startups with a positive social impact on global Muslim communities. Okay, I just want to dive right in. Start with you, Mark. We were talking about the bad actors and the fact that there seems to be nothing but bad actors involved in this crisis, and the poor innocent people of Syria are paying the price.
This is the global blowback of 2 decades or 3 decades of neoliberalism. The US is the force that really started this with the invasion of Iraq and then the dismantlement of the Iraqi army. And then it goes on and you have the Iraqi insurgency, which certainly did not need to respond to the US occupation with this kind of horrific terroristic violence. And then every other actor just started playing a role. And in Syria, it's just all come back. And now you have the Russians finally coming in and just making it a perfect storm of ultra-violence. Everyone has an agenda, and the one agenda that is getting screwed completely is, of course, the people of Syria and the people of Iraq, who are really the victims of everyone. And the only way they can make it better at this point is to get out.
So we also talked a little bit about ISIS and the threat of ISIS. And obviously, Mark, when you and I were talking, we talked about how ISIS is directly also contributing to this tremendous refugee crisis, just like all the other elements at play. But Shahed, you had an interesting perspective about the threat of ISIS as it pertains to different people from different lenses.
Right, and because technology has allowed us to see, the full spectrum of what's happening, we forget sometimes that each of us has a different role to play and a different responsibility. So, for example, within government, ISIS is seen as this political military threat that destabilizes alliances at the very top end. But when you take that to the average person, and specifically like Muslim American communities, for example, it represents a very different threat. It's a threat to identity. It's a threat to community stability. And if we mix the two, if we try to get citizens to act like governments and governments to act like citizens, we mess things up. And so we have to be very careful about how we respond.
America can't combat them because we help create them, and the US military benefits from their increased presence. The Saudis are the biggest funders, and the Qataris and everyone, even Russia, as we see. For Putin, who with the collapse of the price of oil, people are starting to rumbling in Moscow, let's go join the war in Syria. Then everyone has to shut up and be patriotic. This is really where grassroots social entrepreneurism becomes crucial. I saw it in Sweden, for example, how just the images of these poor drowned children moved tens of thousands of people to take personal action and force their governments to act.
Waiting to rely on governments or on the UN is not going to be as effective. And I think, as you were saying, the images of people, real people in Europe being so welcoming is one of the best ways to fight ISIS.
Pay attention to the difference between how individual citizens reacted versus how governments reacted. This is very telling because that doesn't just apply in the case of the refugees. It applies everywhere to all of these situations. We have the ability now to project ourselves into the world in ways we never could in history before. And so we now have to take that, we now have the responsibility on our shoulders, right? So, we do things like Kickstarter campaigns and that's great, but it's not enough.
With social media, you can do incredible things at a micro level. Mm-hmm. But if you have all these interests at a macro level in continuing the violence, in supporting authoritarian regimes, in continuing a fossil fuel economy that is causing so much damage globally, how do we become more effective against governments? We saw it in Egypt. I was there during the revolution. When enough people come on the street, and when did that happen, though? When Facebook and Twitter was turned off. But it took Facebook, the internet being turned off, to get all the couch revolutionaries, right, off their butts and into the street.
The shift is from using social media to let people know what's going on to now using social media to actually affect change and affect solutions to what's going on. And that's the big shift that's starting to happen. Frankly, it's not happening quickly enough, but it is starting to happen.
So is there hope?
I think there's hope, but I think in the end you have to change government policy, and the only way you do that is for people to become more educated and be willing to actually sacrifice their time, and even more than their time, their money, their position, to actually stop this insanity. And until they're willing to do that, no matter what we do on a grassroots level, it's like fingers in a dike that's starting, that's eventually going to crumble.
I draw hope from things like looking at Central Africa. I mean, looking at Africa over the last 20 years, for example. We made so much progress, in just, alleviating human misery in 20 years that when I look at the Middle East, I have hope that in 20 years that we can recover, but we have to make that turning point now.
This crisis is affecting everybody, Arabs, Muslims, people in the West. Everyone is perpetually talking about what's going on with ISIS and seeing the images of other human beings just suffering so much. So if you could give some really very practical advice to young people on what they can do to try and make a difference, what would it be?
The single most important thing people can do first is educate themselves. And as they learn more about the longue durée of history, then they can understand where perhaps they can make a difference today.
Evolve past being a passive observer. It is so easy to plug yourself into some really cool existing things that are happening, but it's also easy enough to come up with your own initiative. There may be something that you're thinking of that no one's ever thought about before. And if it works, great. If it doesn't work, you can always try something new. It's so easy today to do that. So I encourage you to kind of get up off your couch and try to think of something to help, something that you can do to join or to create.
I don't know if you guys have heard that there is a Kickstarter campaign going on now that has been started to help the refugees, which is very unusual for Kickstarter because it's usually about business ventures. So Shahed, have you heard about it?
I haven't heard about it, but I would caution people, it's very easy to start a Kickstarter campaign on things. You need to find out, what do the refugees really need? What are they really asking for? What is really going to help them? Unfortunately, with Kickstarter and a lot of other crowdfunding campaigns, there's been a lot of graft, there's been a lot of fraud, and people are willing to jump on people's sympathy to take advantage of it. So just be an informed donor.
It's very important that as much of the money as possible gets to the refugees. And there are a lot of organizations that have a lot of experience on the ground. And before I would, no matter how well-intentioned, go with any new campaign, I would look for the most important relief organizations and organizations that have been working with the refugees the last few years. And if you want to give money, start with them.
Shahed and Mark, I want to thank you both again for joining us and giving us your insight on this really difficult topic. And everybody watching, thank you for tuning in and thank you for listening to us. And I definitely want to hear your thoughts and your comments. What do you think of what we were talking about? Want to hear your opinion? We also want to know what topics you want us to talk about and you want to hear about. And make sure to subscribe to our channel. We'll see you next time. Thanks.